There's Nick Jones from the DHB's an apology, Shelley from Burnfield from Central Hawke's Bay, Charles Lambert from Wairoa, and also Tim Atkins from Central Hawke's Bay.
And I have to duck away at 11 a.m, sorry, so just let you know that now.
Thank you. And also Kevin Atkinson is an apology as well.
And Barbara Arnott, please.
Oh, and Barbara Arnott as well. So would someone move those apologies be received?
Yep.
Thank you.
Sorry, who next?
Oh, no, not Nigel.
Nigel, sorry.
Legal and the seconder?
She's on the DHB.
Just in terms of meeting procedure, and I know there's an awful lot of people here, we'll try and get through the formal part of the meeting and then allow Jim Graham to present his findings on his study tour. So in that sense, we may juggle the agenda a little to ensure that we get through that first before we actually deal with Graham, and that means if there's any extended questions at the end, then we're not compromised. But I'll try and ensure we get through far enough. The minutes of or any conflicts of interest to be declared? Thank you. The minutes of the previous meeting held on the 11th of April, would someone that was here, like to move? Thank you. Seconder? Yep. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. Is there any minor items of business that need to be raised that are not currently on the agenda? So we know in advance. If not, thank you. In actual fact, we may, because of the timing and person you're going to leave, we'll do Jim now, actually. I'd like to introduce Jim Graham. He's the Principal Advisor Water Quality for Water New Zealand. He's got an extensive background in the health industry and safe drinking water, and I'm sure his credentials are unchallenged in the New Zealand environment. So we're privileged to understand that Jim undertook a tour overseas and saw a number of different water suppliers and met with them and discussed a number of items that are relevant in terms of some of the discussions that are currently going on within New Zealand and Hawke's Bay at the current time. So I'll pass over to you, Jim, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I might just stand here and speak as loudly as I can, if that's okay. Need to get the presentation up, which will be where?
They're on the screen?
Oh, it's right there.
Yep. That's it.
Right. So thanks very much, Garth, and thanks for having me along. So just very briefly, I'm Jim Graham. I've been in the water sector for nearly 30 years. And I'm not an engineer, I'm not a water engineer. My background's public health. I've come through public health. I've been a health protection officer, a drinking water assessor. I was national coordinator of drinking water assessors. And I worked in the DHBs and public health, looking specifically at water supplies and regulation around water supplies. I worked in the Ministry of Health for 3 years. We worked on the legislation back in 2007. I worked a lot on the drinking water standards for New Zealand and the old subsidy scheme for small water supplies. I then spent 9 years with a big international consultant company where I worked with water suppliers on those things of regulation and particularly on managing risk in water supplies, and that's been one of my main areas of focus. How do you manage those inherent risks in a water supply? And subsequent to that, a couple of years ago, I joined Water New Zealand, and I've been with them since, working through questions around water quality and drinking water quality, which seems to be, I mean, it's quite interesting to me that for many years I was talking about these things and no one seemed particularly interested. And then we had some events in August 2016, and the whole the whole environment has changed. The whole ground is quite completely shifted, and the things that I've been talking about for years suddenly went from being something that no one wanted to hear about to something that was front and centre for many, many people. I want to talk about what I found out when I travelled overseas to look at water supplies that don't use chlorine, and how they do that and why they do that. But just before I do, I want to just talk about a couple of things. And the first is this question of chlorine and why people use chlorine in water supplies. Because I mentioned that a lot of my work is about managing risk. The simple fact of the matter is chlorine is a substance which is used across the globe very effectively to manage risk in water supplies. That's why we add it to water supplies, because it's a tool for managing risk. And it's a very effective tool for managing most microbiological risks. It works very effectively. It's relatively low cost, and it's relatively simple to administer. And so that's why people use it. It was first used about 1908-09 was when it was first developed for use in a water supply. And from 6 years after that time in the US, so it was first really used in the US in Jersey City, because there was across the globe at that time many deaths associated with from typhoid associated with water supply. And it's a whole long story, but this guy, Mr. Leal, added it to water supply. It was so successful in stopping the typhoid outbreak in Jersey City that within 6 years in the US, they went from no people drinking water with chlorine to 50% of the water supply people in the US drinking water with chlorine in it. So it had this very dramatic effect. And if you look at the graphs of deaths from typhoid from the date of use of chlorine in a water supply, the number of deaths from typhoid just plummets. And subsequently, the number of the life expectancy or infant mortality rate plummets as well, and life expectancy increases. So you can't deny those statistics. I can show you, I don't have them today, but I've got all those graphs. So chlorine's been very effective. I guess it begs the next question, which is, if that's the case, can you have a water supply without chlorine in it? Is it safe to do that? Is it possible to do that? And my opinion about that, which I'll come to after a long time we look at this question, is yes, it is possible. And it's my firm view that yes, it is definitely possible to have a water supply without chlorine. And the reason I say that is because I've looked at water supplies all across the world. And some water supplies, use of chlorine for me is absolutely essential. For others, it's successful not to use it. So we're talking about places like the Netherlands, and a lot of people talk about the Netherlands. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Denmark's a good example. West Germany, I always say that, it's just Germany now, isn't it? And has been for quite some time. And also places in Canada, I've seen very successful unchlorinated water supplies in places in Canada and the US. So just up front, I'll just state clearly that my view is that it is possible. However, if you're going to have a water supply without chlorine, you need to be very sure that you have other procedures and things in place to manage the public health risk. Because at the end of the day, providing a safe water supply is about managing risk to water supply. It's all about managing risk and managing the risk to public health. So, just with that proviso, we'll launch in, and I want to talk about two places that I've looked at pretty carefully. One's the Netherlands and one's Denmark. And they're quite different. They're very different approaches. Neither of those countries use chlorine in their water supplies, but they have a very different approach to it. So the first place I want to talk about is Netherlands. Netherlands got a total of 9 water suppliers. They used to have a whole lot. They regionalised all their water suppliers and changed a whole lot of things around. They do a lot of things, those water suppliers. They're generally water and wastewater, but some of them have involvement in waterways like canals and looking after bridges and the like. But they're big organisations and they spend a lot of money. The Netherlands used to use chlorine. They used to have chlorine in their water supplies. They stopped using it, and their motivation for stopping using is very different to the motivation we have in New Zealand. They stopped, or the main motivation, they stopped using chlorine, or made a decision to stop using chlorine in the late 70s. And the reason was that at that time there was some research that came out that suggested that when chlorine combined with organic material, it produced what we call disinfection byproducts, trihalomethanes, chloramines, all sorts of things. And there was some evidence at that time that suggested those byproducts contributed to cases of cancer, particularly bladder cancer. And so the Dutch decided that on the basis of that evidence, they didn't want to have chlorine in their water supplies. Also in part because their water supplies have high levels of organic material, so there's a lot for the chlorine to react with. And that's the nature of the water supplies, which I'll explain in a moment. So subsequent research and evidence has suggested that that risk is nowhere near what it was thought to be in the 70s. In fact, the risk now from chlorine disinfection byproducts is considered to be negligible if it exists at all. And so those reasons have subsequently been demonstrated to be not well founded. What happens with chlorine when it combines with organic material, it produces chloramines, and it's the chloramines that give us that taste and odour, smell. It's not the actual chlorine, it's the combination of chlorine with those organic materials. So on that basis, the Dutch decided that they would remove chlorine from their supply. There's a few things we have to understand about the Dutch water supplies. In particular, there's a misunderstanding that Dutch water supplies are similar to New Zealand water supplies. And in actual fact, that's not the case, particularly the big cities. So Amsterdam, Rotterdam, some of the other big cities don't use groundwater supplies like we do. So in New Zealand, when we don't use chlorine, we're using a groundwater supply. So the Dutch use a surface water supply. And if you look at Amsterdam here, they have two sources of water for the Amsterdam supply. One is the Rhine, which is a very dirty river. It's come all across Europe, and at that point, the branch the Rhine uses is very dirty. They use what's called polder water. In other words, this is a low area in the Netherlands, and water seeps into it from lakes and from groundwater, seeps into it. So it's exposed to the surface. Now, a lot of the land it's coming through is peatland. Denmark is sand and Denmark. The Netherlands is built on sand and peat, and so the water coming through the peat carries a lot of organics, and that's why they had this problem with the formation of chloramines. So they have these two water sources, and contrary to popular belief, the Dutch treat their water extensively. So unlike New Zealand, where we have no non-chlorine supplies, we take it out of the ground generally and we supply it without any further treatment. The Dutch treat their water supplies extensively because they're surface waters and they're loaded with microbiological contaminants, and so they need serious treatment. And here's an example. So the water from the Rhine is first treated with a coagulation process. They add an aluminium coagulant. It then goes through a rapid sand filtration process, and then they pipe it out to the coast where there's a whole lot of sand dunes, and they run it into channels along the sand dunes and let it infiltrate through the sand. That's a big natural sand filter, and they collect it at the bottom, and then when they collect it, they put it through another rapid sand filtration process, and then it undergoes ozone treatment. That's a very powerful disinfectant. They add ozone to the water and it kills any organisms in there, microorganisms. They then soften the water because it's very hard. It has high levels of magnesium and calcium in it. And then it undergoes carbon filtration, another filtration, and then slow sand filtration, which is another filtration process not really used in New Zealand. There's only one place in New Zealand that It's a particular process. So here's a process for this water from the river that involves no less than 5 filtration steps. So that's a lot of treatment. That's a lot of water treatment. The polar water, similar, except it doesn't have the sand filtration, and but it similar has those three treatment processes and ozone disinfection. So what the Dutch do is nothing like what we do in New Zealand. So when I hear people say, well, you can have a water without chlorine because they do it in the Netherlands, I always think, well, it's not a very good example. It's not a good comparison because what they do is very different to what we do in New Zealand. So here's a picture here. Here you can see the water that comes into these sandhills. This is over the coast. It's been piped all the way from a long way away. It's put in these channels here and it soaks down and they remove it in this channel over here. And if you have a look at the process, you can see here's the infiltration ditches. It soaks down here. It takes, I think, about 3 months to get down through the sand, comes through a drain and take it off in these channels and take it off for disinfection and further filtration. So the Dutch example for me is not such a good one. Here's the final stage of this water treatment plant, what they call slow sand filtration. Slow sand filtration is a biological process, and so you put the water in these big tanks with sand in it. It filters through the sand, but on top of the sand there's a biological layer called a Schmutzdecker, and that biological layer is full of microorganisms which consume other microorganisms that you don't want in the water. And so they have these massive big buildings with huge footprint here involved with this slow sand filtration. So I don't think the Dutch process provides us with any assistance in this question of unchlorinated water supplies, simply because it's not comparable. It doesn't look like unchlorinated water supplies in New Zealand. It's a different approach and their motivation is quite different. So where should we look? Well, the other place that I visited and met with water suppliers and discussed it with a lot is Denmark. So Denmark is very, very different. Denmark has never used chlorine. They've never used chlorine in their water supplies, except for when they're disinfecting new pipes or they've done a repair and they might want to disinfect a small part. But they've never used chlorine as a main treatment process. The other thing that's really interesting about Denmark is they do not use surface water. Every water supply in Denmark is a groundwater supply. Every water supply is a groundwater supply. And it's not surprising because Denmark has had 2 million years of ice going backwards and forwards across the country. As a result, it's very flat. And it's made up of glacial outwash gravels, which are very similar to the alluvial gravels that you find in New Zealand. So it provides us with a very good model because of those similarities of the type of water they're using, groundwater, and the fact that they take it straight from the ground and generally without further treatment distribute it as a safe water supply. But that tends to be where the similarities end in terms of a comparison. If we want to have chlorine-free water supplies in New Zealand, I would argue that we can look to no better place than Denmark and the way they do it if we want to see how it's done successfully. Now that's not to say Denmark hasn't had waterborne illness outbreaks. They have, and they have over the years had problems with their water supplies. But they put a huge amount of effort into ensuring their supplies are safe. And in two parts. One, they ensure that the water they abstract is very safe to drink. And the second part they put a lot of effort into is once they've abstracted it, that it stays safe in the water supply network. So how do they do that? Well, there's a bunch of things. And the first thing is they do an extraordinary amount of research work on the groundwater supplies. There's 3 aquifers below the country of Denmark. And just by comparison, Denmark's a very small place. The population's in about the same range as New but it's very small. It's about the same size as Hawke's Bay, is that correct? a little bit bigger than Hawke's Bay, just a little bit bigger than Hawke's Bay, the whole country. And like I said, it's dead flat and the ground is very soft. So they don't have a whole lot of hills and a whole lot of rocks and stuff like that, which makes a difference in terms of what they do. So they've had a register for their bores. They've got something like 300,000 bores registered on this register, which was started in 1926, but has data going back all the way to 1888. And that information is all publicly available. It's a massive database. And they do a huge amount, so each one of these dots represents another bore. Some of them are irrigation bores, some of them are water supply bores, some of them monitoring bores, all sorts. They do a huge amount of research on those aquifers. They know an awful lot of information about how and when they recharge, what the effects of abstraction are, what the quality of the water is, what effects activities on the surface, on the land, have on those aquifers. And I was just staggered by the amount of research that they do and that they fund. So for example, they model all of Denmark's aquifers is modelled. And so these squares represent the different models and some of them overlap, but they're doing a huge amount of modelling work to figure out how that water is behaving under the ground, because they want to understand what the risks are to that groundwater. If they do such and such over here, what effect will it have on the water over here? You know, if they're going to have development of urban areas over here, then what will that do to the water supply over here? And they have had problems. They have had problems. They've had certainly problems with over-abstraction. And the government in Denmark introduced a whole bunch of measures to reduce the amount of water they used. They've got nitrate issues. That won't be a surprise to too many people here. It's similar to New Zealand. And they have had questions around pesticide use. And so they do extensive pesticide monitoring. They do a huge amount of monitoring of the groundwater. And they have a whole lot of restrictions about what you can and can't do on the land surface. So if you want to undertake an activity, a land-based activity, the first question that is asked is what effect will that have on our groundwater supplies? Because the Danes really place a very high value on their water supplies and the fact that they have water supplies without chlorine. That's really important to them. So they don't accept or tolerate any activities that would threaten that. And so they have quite what we would call consenting processes. They have quite comprehensive consenting processes around those activities. So the groundwater management is based on the mapping resources and that particular water balance within the aquifers in relation to surface water and of course seawater infiltration as well. Always looking at that balance between abstraction and recharge, and the vulnerability, and I mentioned these action plans. They have these quite comprehensive action plans around their groundwater. If you're going to have a farm and do a particular cultivation or dairy or whatever it is you want to do, you have to have an agreement to undertake that activity and a whole lot of rules around what you can and can't do with that activity. They're actively reforesting certain areas where they feel things are vulnerable, and they have this budget of equivalent to $345 million per year, which they spend on source water research alone. Source water research. So that's a huge amount of money spent in an area a little bit bigger than the Hawke's Bay. And all of this is supported by legislation. So they take it very seriously, they put a lot of work in, and they spend quite a lot of money. Where does that money come from, that 345 million? It comes from people who are consumers of those water supplies. So in Denmark, everybody pays for the amount of water that they use, and the government puts a tax on what they pay, and that tax funds this 345 million amongst other bits of research that they do. So here's a little example. Here's a water storage tank. What's different about this storage tank? It's made of stainless steel. So the Danes, they don't muck around with anything that they think is less than the best material that you can use for water supply. So they don't use concrete or steel or timber tanks with liners in them. They just build from stainless steel now. This is a change they've made. They build from stainless steel. And the other thing that's really interesting about this big tank is it's not outside. So they've started putting all their storage tanks inside buildings, so that there's no risk of birds or vermin or anything getting into them. So that's just an indication of the levels of things that they would go to, the levels of prevention of contamination that they'll go to. And they don't hesitate to take this kind of approach. So, what are the key factors about what the Danes do? I mentioned research, and it's not just research about those aquifers in that ground. They do an enormous amount of research into their networks and the risks in their networks and how to manage those risks. So the research is government funded from water taxes, and it involves the regulator, drinking water regulator, the drinking water suppliers, and the universities. And this is common across all of Europe. I saw this all over Europe. 3 parties to research. And the water supplier and the regulator might decide what research they think needs to be done, and they would engage and collaborate with the universities, and it would be funded out of those that government fund. And so I PhD students all over the place doing all this kind of research into water supply. We don't do that in New Zealand. We don't do that in New Zealand. And this is a big difference between what happens in Europe and what happens in New Zealand. We're not doing anywhere near the amount of research that I think we should be doing, and certainly that's done in those countries. And they do these comprehensive source water risk assessments, a GARP, a groundwater assessment of risk of pathogens, and a QMRA, quantitative microbiological risk assessment. They're standard. So if you're going to use a groundwater source, you've got to look at where that water's coming from, what's the recharge zone, and you've got to do a comprehensive assessment of all the risks in that recharge zone, including, when we say QMRA, that's a quantitative assessment. So that says if you've got a dozen cattle 5 kilometres upstream in your recharge zone, you're going to admit what level of pathogens, and statistics and mathematics will tell us what level of those pathogens we would expect to see in the groundwater at the point of abstraction. It's very comprehensive. And by the way, the New Zealand government and the new regulator is looking at doing this, taking this approach in New Zealand with the new regulator set up. Continuous monitoring of bore levels in groundwater, so that all of the bores that they have there have little probes on them which continuously monitor the level in that bore, going up and down, the recharge and discharge. So they have real-time information all the time available about what's happening in the aquifer. And if they see anything unusual, that's all alarmed, and if they see anything unusual, they investigate it straight away. Why has that happened? Why is that recharge not happening the way we thought it was? Because anything that's a change indicates there may be a risk, and if there's a risk and it's not being managed, that could play out in the quality of the water that people are getting provided with. In some areas, water is still treated. So in some areas, they still have some water softening and other treatment processes, but they're not disinfecting the water. They do have, in some places, UV units installed at the water supplies, but they don't run them unless they see there's a problem. And so they have them there sitting on standby, and if they get information that suggests there may be a risk with the source water, they'll turn on the UV system. When that risk they feel is gone, then they'll turn it back off again. Meticulous management of storage. So they're absolutely full, and I showed you that tank. They are constantly looking at the risks around storage and trying to improve it. They don't just put a tank up on a hill and leave it there and go and see it every month to make sure that the rats haven't got into anything like that. It's a key focus. And so what they say is, in terms of water, find it clean, keep it clean, distribute it clean. Those are the three things that they say: find it clean, keep it clean, distribute it clean. As well as that, they continuously monitor network flow and pressure. So across their whole network, they have continuous monitoring of flow and pressure. So when I say continuous monitoring, that means that it's a analyzer that is checking at least every minute what the flow and pressure is at a particular point, and they're across the whole network, and sending that information back to your telemetry where it's downloaded, recorded, and they can graph it. And there's people watching that, and it's alarmed. So if anything changes, then they can know automatically. And the way they construct their networks is quite different to what we do in New Zealand. So if you've got a network and you know it looks like a tree. So what they do is they take the network and they divide it up into quite small units, and they have one supply point per little area. And they have connections from these areas to the neighbouring areas, but they're closed. And so they have one supply point, and they can monitor that supply point so they know exactly how much water is going into that particular little discrete zone. Okay? And as well as that, all of the connections in that zone are metered. So they're all metered, and they're all smart metered. And so they can do what we call a mass balance calculation. They can add up all of the results from all of the meters and say, this is how much water has been taken out of this little zone. And then they can compare it to the meter that's metering how much water is going into that zone, and they can see the difference, and they can know very quickly if there's what level of water loss they've got and if it's changed. Okay, so they're always looking for those changes. So that continuous monitoring of flow and pressure is considerable. And they don't just collect the information and ignore it, they look at it all the time. The other thing is looping, what we call looping, and so they don't have any dead ends in their network. There's no dead ends. Wherever a water pipe comes to a dead end, they've picked it up and brought it across to it so that water is flowing around all the time. It's not going to a pipe and sitting in a pipe. So looping is another thing that they're very keen on. Universal metering, and this everywhere I went that was using unchlorinated supplies, they all said to me universal metering is essential because the costs are pretty high. And so the other you've got to collect that revenue, and they were very clear that the only way to do that is to have a meter at every point of supply and to charge people for the amount that they use. And so universal metering was common, and this was the case, Germany, the US, Canada as well. And people stressed to me the importance of universal metering and collecting the revenue, because one of the things that people said to me is the consumers of this water should be the ones who pay for it, just like electricity, just like your petrol. If you're going to use it, then you should be paying for it. It shouldn't be buried in with your rates collection, etc., etc. They were very clear to me, and these are not my ideas. These are what people were telling me. I talked about that mass balance assessment of demand versus supply, and they do it across the whole network. So then they can add up all those discrete supply points and say how much water have we provided into this network, how much has come out, and they can use that to work out what is their water loss. And this is a very, very critical point, because in New Zealand water loss is around, most supplies, somewhere around 20%, 25%. And in New Zealand, if you get to 15%, we give you a pat on the back and say, well done, that's really low amount of water loss, really good. I've seen water supplies with 50, 60% water loss. In Denmark, water loss is around about 5%. And it's required to be, they target between 4 and 7% of water loss. So they have very low leakage rates, and if they get to 10%, the regulator fines the water supply. It says, you're losing too much water, we're going to fine you. And they give them quite hefty fines. In the Netherlands, water loss is 2%. 2%. And I've even seen figures from Tokyo of 0.5% of water loss. So what they do is they maintain a very, very high quality network. They don't have a whole lot of old pipes that have been in there for 70, 80 years. They replace pipes all the time, and if they get any indication that pipes are deteriorating or they're getting too much breakage, they just replace the whole section, the whole area. In the Netherlands, they told me that if they are replacing a sewer pipe in a particular length of street, particular area, and they're digging up the road, they'll just replace the water pipe anyway. If it's more than 20 years old, they'll just replace it anyway. Because they say they're there, they got the road dug up, they're putting pipes in, they might as well replace the water pipes as well. So that's a completely different mindset. In New Zealand, we tend to run to fail. We tend to operate until we go, we can't get any more life out of this. So it's quite a proactive approach. And the other thing there, I think that's the last one, is this comprehensive backflow program. So backflow is when you get a negative pressure in your water supply, and this links to your leakage rates. Because if you've got a lot of leakage, you've got holes in your network. And if you get a negative pressure, so when the supply is under pressure, water goes out, that's your leakage. When you get a negative pressure, let's say a section of pipe's been shut down for a repair, or there's a fire and the fire service is pumping heavily from the main, that water's going to come back in through those holes. And so backflow prevention is really important. And if you don't have a backflow prevention device at every connection, when you get that negative pressure, someone's got the hose in the swimming pool, you're going to suck water out of their swimming pool into your network. Or maybe they've got a bucket there and they're mixing up some herbicide to spray on their roses. And you've got the hose in there and you're going to suck that. So this is real stuff. It's happened. There's plenty of times it's happened, and there's been some really tragic cases of people being badly poisoned through backflow. So what they say in Denmark is every connection must have a backflow device. Every single connection. And where there's any risk that's elevated above a domestic household, and so typically in domestic household connections you have what's called a double check valve, so it's got two backflow valves. You have what's called a testable device, and normally it's what we call a reduced pressure zone device, and it's something you can test. And so in New Zealand the law says that you should test your testable backflow devices annually. Hardly anyone does that. I think there's probably only one council that I could say actually meets the New Zealand legislative requirements. I'm not saying who they are. And so I said, so do you test them annually? And they says, oh no, that's nowhere near often enough. 2 or 3 times a year they test their backflow devices. So if you're going to do that, you've got to make sure those backflow devices are there. You've got to have a record of where they all are. You've got to have people available who are skilled and trained in testing those devices. You've got to have a program to make sure they get around all. So behind these ideas, behind these ideas, is people and expertise and a whole bunch of way of doing things. So I've got it twice there on volumetric charging, which I mentioned before. So the sorry, I just lost my thought there. The volumetric charging, so all of these things come together and demonstrate the way that the Danes do these things. As I said before, it's fully 100% consumer funded, and the Danes pay about $3 per cubic metre of water. About $3 per cubic metre of water is what they pay. And remember, about a third of that goes straight to the government for the research. Now, in New Zealand we have a range of different prices and for water, and some of it's quite hard to figure out what the actual cost is, because it's paid through rates, but I think in many places people are paying 70, 80, 90 cents. If New Zealand water supplies were wanting to get up to this model of what the Danes do, and it's a perfectly laudable goal, there's 2 problems with it. One is the Danes have been doing this from the beginning. They never used chlorine, and they developed and built their networks and their water supplies around this idea. So their $3 per cubic metre is a minimum. if you're going to start and try and retrofit this approach, the cost would be a lot higher initially. And the other problem is it takes a long time. It takes a long time to get your water loss down from 20% to 5%. So there's some quite difficult problems in getting to the situation the Danes have. It's not impossible. It's not impossible, and it's a very good goal to have. But we need to be realistic about the difficulties there might be and how we might do it. But at the end of the day, it's a question of level of service. It's about level of service. It's about the level of service that people want, and it's about that level of service being addressed through the asset management, and it's about people being prepared to pay to get that level of service if that's what people want. And I'll just finish on one note, because when I was in Denmark, I was with a person who's Danish but lives in New Zealand, and she said to me, one of the key differences between Denmark and New Zealand, which allows the Danes to operate their water supplies in the way they do, and allows them to charge what are reasonably high costs for water, is that she said the Danish public have a high level of trust in government. They have a high level of trust in local government and a high level of trust in central government. And so when local government or their water suppliers say you need to do we need to do this and we need to charge you for it, they don't find the same level of pushback from the public, because people understand that that's what needs to happen. So, for example, in 2010, the Danish government was unhappy with the way that local authorities were operating water supplies, and they passed a law that said water supplies are not, and wastewater systems are not allowed to be operated by local authorities anymore. They passed a law, and so water supplies in Denmark are now set up. They're set up as what we would call CCOs, and so they're community, they're not-for-profit organisations, they're still publicly owned, but they have a board, and the local authorities have members on that board, but they are separate, discrete organisations from local authorities. And that was another thing that people said was really important, because the water supplier, they say, needs to have front and centre one function, and that's supply of water. It doesn't need to be having decisions about whether it spends money on something over here or the water supply. It needs to collect that money and spend it all on water supply. So that was the other thing that they stressed to me that they thought was very important in Mark. They've done it in the Netherlands with these 9 big water supplies. The interesting thing was that in Denmark they don't have large water supplies, large regional water supplies. They still have many small water supplies, but they still have that corporate model, separation from local government, and they still have that volumetric charging. So there you go. That's about everything I want to say on that topic. Very interesting trip. I went to a conference in Edinburgh, but I specifically went and met with several water suppliers just to answer this question, because I felt for a long time that it must be possible to have a water supply without chlorine, but I wanted to know what it looked like successfully. And I guess the thing that struck me about what the Danes did was that while they didn't use chlorine and never have, they had an acute sense of the importance of water being safe, and an acute sense of risk and risk to public health. And that acute sense of risks and risk to public health drove their decision making. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Obviously, Jim's prepared to take questions from around the table and members of the committee. And I'll start it off. Is the earthquake risk that places like Hawke's Bay have, does Denmark have the same exposure in terms of their aquifers? And if they do, how do they deal with that?
It's a really good question, because Denmark is a seismically inactive zone. They don't have earthquakes. They're on continental crust, and in the middle of a big continental crust, and they just don't have the seismic activity that we have. And they did point that out to me actually while I was there. They are talking about the differences. Yeah, that was a significant difference that they don't have. They don't have that seismic risk.
Kirsten?
Thank you, Jim. Very informative. You mentioned at the start that the Netherlands have a combination of groundwater versus surface water. What would the percentage breakdown be between the two?
The big supplies, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and those bigger cities use surface waters. Smaller supplies use groundwater. So I would be guessing, but I suspect it's probably, in terms of volume or population, it's probably about a 70-30 split.
Okay, and the groundwater supply systems, what sort of treatment process do they use?
With the groundwater supplies, a lot of them are using UV disinfection, and some of them will be using filtration systems. But the thing about the Netherlands is a lot of the treatment is around removal of organics. So it's something we don't do a lot of in New Zealand, but because that water's coming from ground that's a lot of it's peat, it carries a lot of organic material, and that affects your taste. Strongly, and a lot of it's also quite hard water. So they're softening the water and they're removing organics as a lot of the kind of. So the interesting thing is that I don't know how many of you have been to Amsterdam, and the water's safe to drink out of the tap. But you wouldn't want to, because it's absolutely foul-tasting water. It's really unpleasant, and that is because A, the organics, and B, the hardness of it. Even though they're doing softening, it's still quite unpleasant. Whereas in Denmark, the water is very nice.
Okay, so following on from that, with regards to the organics, given that chlorine is not effective against protozoa, so Giardia, Cryptosporidium, and that represents quite a significant part of the organics that we're dealing with. How do they deal with the risks associated with protozoa?
So that's a good question. And so organics is not micro. So protozoa are microbes. They're microbiological organisms. Organics is largely old, decayed trees and things like that, material that's left in the ground. So it's peat's rotted down, forest and the like. So the organics is actually organic material. So what you're talking about though is protozoa, which are microorganisms, and you're right, chlorine doesn't control them. That's a very good question. So in the surface water supplies, they're treating with ozone, and the reason they're treating with ozone is that ozone's a very strong disinfectant, and it will kill viruses, bacteria, and protozoa. In the groundwater supplies, and again this is the case in Denmark, and it's important because what you find, so there's three main microbiological contaminants: bacteria, viruses, and protozoa. Okay, so protozoa are the largest, and they're quite large. I mean, you can't see them with the naked eye, but they're quite large, about 3 microns in diameter, and they live in this cyst state. The thing about them is because they're quite large, they're easily removed as water filters through soil or sand. And so you just don't very often find protozoa in groundwater. It's very, very unusual. The groundwater needs to be exposed to surface water very close to where it's being abstracted. So I've sampled quite shallow bores, about 6 metres deep, that are in a paddock full of cows in a dairy farm, and we searched there for protozoa and never found it. In fact, the Ministry of Health over the last 10 years had a requirement in the drinking water standards that groundwater supplies needed to be tested to find protozoa, Cryptosporidium particularly. And in all those 10 years in groundwater supplies, they just didn't find Cryptosporidium. You don't find Cryptosporidium in groundwaters, simply because the water is filtered through soil, and so it's a very low risk. That doesn't mean to say you don't find bacteria, because they're smaller, and it doesn't mean to say you won't find viruses. And I think that for me, one of the big concerns about unchlorinated supplies is the risk of viral contamination.
Thank you. And one last question. Why are we seeing a move in developed countries actually opting to remove chlorine from their water supply if there's so many risks associated? What's motivating all these developed countries? So you've said Canada, USA, who clearly introduced it in the first place and have now decided to start removing it. Why is that?
I'm not sure there is a big movement to remove chlorine. The supplies that I've seen in the US and Canada have never used chlorine. They've always been chlorine free. The way they do that has changed quite considerably. And a lot of the chlorine-free movement, as with the Dutch, actually came out of that concern back in the 1970s. Yeah, there might be some suppliers or some people seeking it, but the biggest concern for people is the taste. That's what drives a lot of people's concern about chlorine and water supplies. And my view of that is that the first thing is that if you have a very, very, very good groundwater source, and we do in New Zealand, and you add chlorine, because there's no organics or very few organics in that water, chlorine's got nothing to combine with. You don't get that chlorine taste. So I lived down by Hutt Valley. They didn't used to chlorinate that supply at all. A couple of years ago, they had some quite concerning results from their bores, and they started chlorinating it. When you drink the water in Petonia, the Hutt Valley, you don't taste that chlorine. It's there at a very low level, but you don't taste it because it hasn't found anything in the water to combine with and form those chloramines. And so, I look at the situation. So when you first chlorinate a water, you've got that pipe film, and there's plenty of organic stuff in the pipes for the chlorine to combine with, but it eventually burns off. And eventually, if a water supply, a clean, good groundwater supply, has chlorine added to it, eventually you should avoid that taste and odour issue.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Other questions from around the table? Tom.
A comment and two questions, if I could. Denmark has 6 million people paying that $345 million water tax, right? So there's quite a few more people there to spread the load around. Do they bring the same level of sophistication to their treatment of wastewater, and do they reuse wastewater at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I don't know about the reuse. They certainly aren't reusing it in terms of drinking water. Whether they're reusing it for irrigation, I'm not sure. But do they have a sophisticated process for treatment of wastewater? Yes, they do. I mean, this is the EU. They have very, very high standards for wastewater discharges, and they have very comprehensive treatment programs in place.
So this may be outside your area, but to protect the integrity of the aquifers in Denmark, there must be a pretty substantial land use regulatory regime sitting on top of that, and it sounds like that would involve thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps, of individual consents or whatever the legal formulation would be there. Do you have a sense of that? How rigorous is all of that? And is that included in your $345 million?
The short answer is yes. It's very rigorous. The $345 million is just research of the groundwater.
So it's not asset maintenance or any of that? Just research and monitoring.
So Denmark's quite different from New Zealand in that it doesn't have a whole lot of wilderness areas, and like the Netherlands, they understand pretty much every square metre of their country.
But they are growing stuff on top of that.
Growing stuff on top of it, yeah. But they kind of, the thing that's quite different is they don't have great swathes of their country that is kind of wild and bush, and they don't know too much about, as we do. It's very intensive. They have a very good understanding of the whole place. But yeah, the short answer is right. Yeah, they spend a lot of money on other things as well.
Yeah.
Just as a comment, I think the work that that the tank group are doing around source protection zones and including those in the proposed changes will be one of the first steps in moving towards what Jim's talked about for us in Hawke's Bay. So
Say nothing of universal metering.
potentially. So,
Yeah, well, thank you, Garth. Thank you for the presentation, Jim. Most informative. My question is around you. You mentioned you've been doing this for a long time, and obviously you've been talking to a lot of different local bodies around the country about it. Up until the Havelock North incident, where all hell seemed to break loose, what would you, in your view, what would have been the strongest point of resistance from local bodies to going to something like happening in Denmark and Holland?
Not break.
So I don't quite understand the question.
Well, in your view, what's been the resistance points for the likes of local body councils into taking a much more, I think, holistic approach?
Why haven't we gone down this track?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I think there's a couple of things, and one of the main problems is cost.
Yeah.
Cost is the cost of doing this is huge, and as I said before, it's all very well if you've done it for a long period of time, but retrofitting and going to this from the point where most of our water supplies are is going to be very expensive. So there's cost, and because there's cost, there's political resistance as well. And so those two things. And I guess you could say that well, we've had water supplies without chlorine for a long time in New Zealand, and so maybe it's not that hard because we've been doing it reasonably successfully. But the reality is that one of the things that came out of the Havelock North inquiry was New Zealand really lost touch with the rest of the world and what the rest of the world was doing. In about 2008, when there was a whole bunch of changes at the Ministry of Health, and I won't go into that, but we had really strong international connections through some people at the Ministry of Health. And so we knew what was going on internationally. We lost those connections. And New Zealand really got behind best practice. And so for those water supplies that we have had that have not had chlorine, the way that we were doing it in 2018, for example, was pretty much identical as the way we were doing it in 2008 and 1998. And so we hadn't progressed. If you look at what's happened in those other countries, Denmark, the US and the Netherlands, is they progressed. They progressed over that time. And so we've got a lot of catching up to do. And as I say, I do believe it's possible, and I think it's a very good goal to have. But we need to be very clear about what the implications are.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just would like another one. She's just going to, I know, just point of order, but
sorry.
Before. Yeah,
Just following up, sorry, on the question I asked earlier with the Netherlands, where the groundwater systems use UV treatment. Why would we not use UV treatment instead of chlorination here for our groundwater system?
We can and we do. We can and we do. Yeah. So, but the important thing to remember here is when we use a disinfectant in a water supply like chlorine, we do it for two reasons. We do it first of all to ensure that the water we have abstracted from a source, whether it's groundwater or a river, to ensure that there's no microorganisms or bacteria and viruses. We need a different treatment process because that those organisms are not in the source water. That's one reason why we use chlorine, and because it's cheap and easy. So we've got to be sure that the source water has nothing in it. That's when the Danes say find it clean. So if you can't find it clean, you've got to make it clean. The second reason is that water, once it's in a network, can become contaminated. And so however clean your source water is, once you put it in a network, risks. And again, I mention this word risk because there's the way to think about water supplies, in my view, is to always think about them in terms of risk. And water supply networks have risks. So they have risks in terms of water loss and backflow. They have risks in terms of water storage around reservoirs, and so we can chlorinate to make sure the water's safe once we've abstracted it, but we also chlorinate to make sure that the water becomes contaminated in a network. Then there's what we call a residual chlorine to deal with that contamination if it does occur. So there's been a lot of, there's a famous example in Lower Hutt of contamination of the water supply, and they found a seagull in a reservoir. There's a whole litany of stories of rats or birds or other things that have occurred in reservoirs and networks, no matter how hard you try to keep these things out. And then there's a whole list of stories of backflow events and other contamination events. So it's two parts. Source water, make sure that it's clean, and once it's in the network, to keep a residual to prevent contamination. That's why the Danes say if we don't have chlorine in the network as a residual, you've got to have really low leakage rates, you've got to have really good backflow prevention, you've got to have really meticulous management of your storage.
So the UV treatment is only applicable to the source water, and the disinfectant is then being used to actually protect against contamination within the network. So what guarantee can water providers or councils give, that they're actually providing optimal residual chlorine within their network? I understand Christchurch City Council, 65% of their samples showed that they weren't meeting the required level of residual treatment to actually be effective anyway.
Yeah, so I don't really want to talk about Christchurch because it's becoming a bit of a battlefield, and I've been quite alarmed at some of the things that I hear and see here. So Christchurch, what science tells us is that the optimum, the minimum dose of chlorine is 0.2 milligrams per
Part per million. Part per million.
Yeah. Milligrams per litre, yeah. 0.2 milligrams per litre. Science tells us if you have that, which is a very small amount of chlorine, that controls effectively your viruses and your bacteria. What's happening in Christchurch is because they haven't chlorinated long enough to burn off all the film and organics in their pipes, they're still getting a lot of paste and odour issues. And so one of the ways they're trying to manage that is to reduce the chlorine level down as low as they can possibly get it. And so if you want to have 0.2 milligrams at the extremity of your network, you've got to dose much higher than that because as the water goes through the pipes, your chlorine dissipates and it gets used up. So you've got to dose at a higher level, and people dose it, 0.5 or 0.7 or something like that. So what's happening in Christchurch is they're dosing at that minimum rate, and what it's meaning is that by the time they get down the other end of the network, you won't find any chlorine. So that's part of the issue and argument that's going on down there.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, did you have a...
That was really my question. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, Tom. I'm happy to take questions from other people. Tom?
Given that checklist that you had of the ingredients of a chlorine-free system, how many years would you expect it would take Hawke's Bay to arrive at that point? 50?
I don't know. I can't really answer that question. Craig might be able to answer it better than I could. I suspect 20 years would be very optimistic.
20 years would be optimistic.
I think probably 30 years. And it depends on how much money you want to spend.
Right.
Because what you have to do is you have to have a very
Someone was
aggressive...
getting sick in Napier until the doctor really cancelled it.
So what...
what would be useful for us to hear, it's maybe not at this point, is the glide path that you would recommend to a region like this that had that aspiration. What would be steps 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it water metering? Is it what's sort of the sequence that gets you there in 20 to 30 years?
Okay, so this is kind of off the cuff, but I would say if somebody said to me, we want to get our water supply to be chlorine free, what do we need to do? I would say the first thing you need to do is, and this might be a little bit controversial, but if you look at Denmark and the Netherlands, I'd say the first thing you need to do is you need to have a different structure around your water supplies. And I don't think they necessarily need to be regionalised, but they need to be structured so that the only business that your water supply does is water supply. That's the only business and the only focus. Because if you're going to make these changes, you've got to have a central focus just on water supply, or you might do water and wastewater together. So that's the first thing, is structure. The second thing is you need a revenue stream, a good revenue stream, and so you need universal metering and volumetric charging. And as soon as you've done that, then you need to be looking at reducing leakage. You need to be looking at the looping and monitoring and getting those in place, and you need to be looking at a very comprehensive backflow program. And so this is, I get this from speaking to those people in those countries. That's what they've told me are the essential ingredients. And I think that thinking you could do that in less than 30 years would be, you'd do very well if you could.
Any other questions from around the table? Sandra?
Through you, Chair. Thank you, Jim, for your outstanding presentation. Just interested in your comment about low-level leakage rates and some councils performing better than others in this area. How have they been able to achieve those low-level leakage rates? Is that monitoring or?
Decent point.
Yeah, that's another good question. Where you see low level of leakage rates, normally you see a comprehensive asset management program that understands where all the pipe networks are, what condition they're in, how old they are, what they're made of, and what the vulnerability around it is. That's the first thing. And the second thing you see is a comprehensive renewals program that doesn't just target renewals in, we've had a couple of breaks over in Smith Street, so perhaps we should fix the pipes over there. Uses the data and the information to figure out where you're going to be most effective with the renewals program. And the second thing is, the next thing is not a whole lot of old pipes.
Yep.
So breakage rates is another really good example. If you look at Christchurch, for example, so they've had this terrible series of earthquakes, 2011, 2012. Their breakage rates for their water network are probably 3, 4, 5 times what they are in other parts of the country, simply because their network is so badly damaged from those earthquakes, and that's what you'd expect. The first thing is that comprehensive management, and the next thing is the age and condition.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no other questions,
Gareth?
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask, in terms of consumption per capita, what is it in Denmark compared with New Zealand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. So it varies enormously in New Zealand, and it varies geographically and temporally. So people obviously use more in summer, but the lowest kind of figures I see in New Zealand is around 250 litres per person per day. But I've also seen 1,500 litres per person per day.
400 or something.
And it depends a lot on whether it's urban or rural. So people who live in apartments use a lot less water than people who live in rural areas and have big gardens. It also depends a lot because that figure takes into account leakage as well. In Denmark, because they have such low leakage, the head usage is very low, and I've seen figures of 150 to 200 litres per person per day.
Sandra?
Chair, I think there may be some questions from the floor, and I think that we should invite questions from the floor.
I'm prepared to take a few. I'm just conscious that we have a 12 o'clock deadline, so if we have a few from the floor, I'm happy to. Yes.
Hi Jim, thanks for the presentation. Just got a query. If we weren't able to sort out some of the bigger issues, for example having a major research institute and other types of regulation, and we still tried to go down this route on our own, do you think we'd be successful, or do you think we really need that external support to make that successful?
It's a difficult question. It's going to be a lot easier if there's a national commitment to it. It'll be a lot more difficult to do it because on an organisation on its own, because you've still got to do that research. You've still got to do that research. And the problem in New Zealand is we do research on groundwater. You know, we've got ESR, NIWA, GNS, they're all doing research. It's not particularly well connected up, and it's not particularly well driven by water supply needs. So there's the potential to imagine how that all might work, and with the new regulator that's the government is putting in place, it's expected or has been proposed that organisation will have a significant research function as well. So there's some hope, but it would be way more difficult to do it without that kind of national focus, because the expertise that you need is housed in those organisations like NIWA and ESR and GNS. And so if you want to do that research and get that research undertaken, a local authority is going to have to engage that expertise, and it's pretty expensive. Whereas if there was a national focus and desire to do it, then it would be a lot easier.
Okay. Yeah. Cheers. On my right. I'll come back to you, Dave. Sorry. Yes.
Thank you, Jim, for your presentation. Have you studied the populations of the world and worked out the percentage of countries that have a countrywide or national body looking after their water, and the health outcomes from that percentage, whether or not it's a national body looking after the water and the health outcomes for the whole country versus local bodies looking after their water and health outcomes for their population?
Yeah, good question. And no, I haven't studied that, and so I don't know about that relationship. There's two things I'd say though, and that is, if you look at Europe, pretty much all those EU countries have a central water authority. You know, Water Commission for Scotland, similar in the UK. All those countries have a central organisation that coordinates and has a focus on water. And the second thing I'd say is, one of the great difficulties we have is connecting illness to water supply. It's a very difficult thing to do, and you can only really estimate it. And that is because when people get gastroenteric illnesses, for it to be linked to a water supply, they've got to go to a doctor, have a specimen, get that specimen identified as an organism. Someone's got to go and visit them, have a big discussion with them, and then try and figure out where they picked up, whether it was something they ate or something they drank. And I used to do this for a job, and working in public health, and I'd go and sit down with people. It's really difficult to remember what you had for dinner or where you drank water 3 or 4 days ago. And so it's really difficult to actually find out those statistics. But what we do know is wherever you have a poor water supply with a high level of risk, you do have higher levels of illness. I mean, you just got to look around places near here like the Pacific.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, Jim, the joint seals between connections and pipes, are they deteriorating, and are the new ones actually a lot better, or replacements? Have we got new seals coming through, or the old ones being replaced? How are we with the joint seals with connections between pipes?
So, yeah, I mean, this is not my area of expertise, and I'll be a wee bit careful, but pipe technology has changed enormously in the last 30, 40, 50 years. And Craig will probably know a lot more about this than me, but there was a time when we used a lot of steel or cast iron pipes, and the joints were sealed with lead, and people would hammer lead into the joints, and that would be the seal. So if you look in places like the UK, where they still have a whole lot of lead jointed pipes, and in some places they have actual lead pipes, can you believe it? They add phosphate to their water supply so that to prevent the leaching of lead into the water. What we tend to use now is polyethylene pipe, and the joints are made by electrofusion, and so they have an electrical weld that joins the pipes together. It's not foolproof. So currently the Cook Islands they've got a ring main around the whole of the Cook Islands. It was built by a Chinese company on the basis of a Chinese loan. It's all polyethylene pipe, and it's been electrofusion welded. They did an absolutely terrible job, and when it was all fully installed, leakage rate was almost as bad as the pipe that it had replaced. So the Cook Islands government said, well, we're not going to repay the loan, and so the Chinese government said, well, that's fine, we'll take you to court, and that's still playing out. New Zealand government has just committed, I think, $20 million to fixing that pipe. So the short answer to your question, and I should have got there straight away, is yes, things have improved enormously, but it's not a fail-safe, because it still relies on the expertise and the method that's used and the capability of the people who are doing that pipe joining. But it has improved an awful lot. Yeah.
Thank you. I would take one here and then come.
Just wondering if you want to comment around the level of connectedness in Denmark and Netherlands, around the percentage of properties connected. It's different to the New Zealand one.
So that's a really...
Sorry, can I just... Did everybody hear that question? No, I don't think so. Do you want to be...
The question was, just ask Jim if you could comment on the level of properties connected to a municipal supply.
So it's the levels of properties connected to a supplier.
Yeah, so, and that's another big difference to New Zealand. So what you see in the Netherlands and Denmark is they have a government policy of not having people on on-site wastewater systems or on local community or individual household bores. And so this is a small country, both of them are small countries with pretty soft ground. And so they have these programs, they're just connecting everybody up. They're just connecting everybody up. So not many people in Denmark have got their own bore or the on-site wastewater system. It's really easy in those countries to put pipes in the ground to connect communities. Because it's easy to install pipes, but also the distances aren't great. So Denmark and the Netherlands, they don't have people living spread out all over the place on their own or in little communities. It's very different to New Zealand, and both those countries have programs of just connecting everybody up into community supplies.
300. Thank you, Jim. Yeah. Sorry, yes. Yep.
My question is, the pipes in Denmark, what are they made of?
Yeah, good question. They're replacing everything with polyethylene, same as what we're replacing with. Yeah. They don't have a whole lot of. So they don't have virtually any asbestos cement pipe. So in New Zealand we installed a lot of asbestos cement pipe after the war. That was really common, and we've still got a lot of asbestos cement pipe. Mostly after a while it turns out like wheat bix, but in Denmark they have hardly any asbestos cement pipe. They have very little cast iron pipe left, or steel pipe, and because they have comprehensive renewals programs, there are a lot of PVC or PE.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks, Jim. We'll call it quits at that point. And would someone like to move that the Jim's report be received and noted?
Happy to move, Gareth.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Harry? I know most of the invited people were here for that presentation, so you're welcome to exit if you need to, but you're welcome to stay as well. So please feel free either way. It's not going to embarrass the committee. The next item on the agenda is the tank update. Kerry,
And Marianne.
ask Kerry to.
I'd just like to invite Marianne Baker to the table. She's our senior policy planner who's been working intensively on this plan change.
We might just wait shortly until.
Just one.
I should have done that. Yeah. You're only going to be 2 minutes.
It's an information item, so yes, hopefully.
It's becoming clear that water is more precious than
Yes.
Thanks. Well,
and let's face it.
All right, good morning. Again, just inviting and welcoming Marianne Baker to the table. She's our senior policy planner who's been working extensively on the tank plan change for the last 3 years now. So this paper is just an update from when I last saw you back in April. And there's been quite a lot happening, particularly behind the scenes in terms of the staff commitment and work on the plan change. We've been to the Regional Planning Committee 3 times. If you've read the paper, that will give you a snapshot of what's occurred in the last few months. So back in April, we had received at that point the feedback from the pre-notification consultation. I've identified there in point 5 some of the significant issues that were raised from that feedback. As a consequence, staff have considered that and made some amendments to the tank plan. I think that was version 9.2 back then, potentially. And then the next, and the RPC did not make any or have any resolutions at that committee. They decided to defer the paper to the following committee in July. In between time, we held a workshop with the Regional Planning Committee, and we'd actually gone back to the tank stakeholder group and at their request and updated them on the progress that we'd been making on the plan. And I think actually just at this point, I'd really like to thank the tank stakeholder group, tangata whenua, and everybody who's had a significant amount of input into this process, particularly again those representatives from Napier City Council and Hastings District Council. People have been very highly engaged in this process, and there has been a lot of work which probably isn't well reflected in this paper, but people's time and commitment has been enormous. Particularly also our HBRC staff, planning, science, consents, right across the board. So back in July, yes, like I said, we had the workshop with the RPC, and from that workshop, what was apparent was that there was essentially 4 what we're calling big issues that were raised from that workshop, which were the stream flow enhancement, the groundwater allocation limits, provisions for tangata whenua, and the alignment of the tank plan with the outstanding water bodies plan change. Also, what you'll see in your paper before you is within the paper that we presented to the RPC in July, there was an update on the source protection zones. There's been extensive work undertaken within this organisation from the science team around what is termed the Heretaunga Plains numerical model, and that was considering the source protection zone for around the Hastings district bores. Hastings had undertaken work through Tonkin and Taylor, which provided an analytical model, and the Heretaunga Plains model identified it as a different zone, similar sort of extent in terms of area, but just in a slightly different location. We presented that back to the joint working group and had some discussion around that. There was, I suppose, a different opinion on whether we should be looking to combine the two models, the Tonkin and Taylor and the HBRC models, or if we should just be going with the numerical model. Within that paper to the RPC, staff's recommendation was that for Hastings boards, we would look to the numerical model, and the Napier City boards, we would be looking to the Tonkin and Taylor analytical model at this stage. We then represented the tank plan to the RPC on the 14th of August, but unfortunately there wasn't a quorum, so again we didn't have any decisions made at that meeting. So we're looking forward to the 18th of September, where hopefully we will gain some traction on this plan change, and all being well, we may see the plan notified this side of the election, well, an agreement to notify the content of the plan. And that's where we're at. If you have any questions, please feel free.
Any questions from around the table at the moment? So all those, can I just ask, all those 4 issues, they are going to have positions put to the next meeting that will see them
Yes.
resolved?
So
or
we've
resolved in a
actually-
way that meets the RPC's expectations?
Yeah, and again, behind the sort of the scenes, we've been working with a nominated subgroup from the RPC that involved tangata whenua representatives, councillors, and also Ngāti Kahungunu were invited to that subgroup. So those issues, but particularly the stream flow enhancement and the allocation, were discussed within those subgroups. And we will be going back to the RPC with some further information around decision making under the RMA.
Could I just add there, Garth, for the purposes of this committee, there hasn't been much dissenting opinion about the source protection zones, which is the important part for us to consider.
Yeah. Thank you. The recommendation there is to receive and note the tank plan change update. Would someone like to move accordingly? Thanks, Keith. Seconded. Yeah. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Carried. Next item on the agenda is the joint working group activities. There is a subsequent report that was sent out, missed the agenda, so hopefully everybody received that. That's under item 7.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It missed the agenda because we wanted to report on the latest meeting, which was held last Thursday. So since the last Governance Committee meeting, the Joint Working Group has met 3 times. We've essentially been progressing work that Kerry's already described around tank and around the source protection zones, but I've also listed in the paper under paragraph 3 the other areas of work that we've been focusing on. The first 2 are really around finalising the communications protocol, and also just outlining to you, just a heads up if you hadn't caught it through any media, potential issue that we'd look to proactively manage around PFAS and the firefighting foam that became an issue at Hawke initially and surrounding groundwater supplies. We focused on a couple of potential areas that may have been affected, particularly around the Hastings Fire Station and also Hawke's Bay Airport, and pleased to report that there was no detectable levels of it at either location. And then more broadly, the update really is around, I guess, as a working group, we've been focusing on tank, but we've also at the same time been learning how to work together more collaboratively. Not saying that we weren't, but it's noticeable, I think, that now that we've got past that hump of the tank workload, that we're really starting to look forward to how else we can do things well together. And for example, each of the 4 territorial authorities is scheduled to present their water safety plans to the group. Hastings District Council and Napier City Council have both done that already, and Wairoa and Central Hawke's Bay are scheduled over the coming meetings, and that's been good to be able to generate quite a bit of discussion, and I guess a lot of that was really encapsulated at our meeting last Thursday when Reynold Ball, one of the drinking water assessors for the region, really highlighted he did his annual implementation update, and I've put in there under 3.4.1 and 3.4.2 really high level findings for him around what's working well and what's still has room for improvement. And I guess if you could summarise those, the opportunities for further improvement are probably really around asset management type activities, but what is working well is a much greater understanding around how we've got to manage the risks for drinking water. There's much better communication between all parties, and an embracing by the local councils about the findings, or his findings, and the need to change direction. So a very positive report really from him on that, and obviously those opportunities for further improvements are still things that we can work on as well. As I said, we've spent a lot of time on the tank plan change, and Kerry's already presented on that, and we do have an item on the agenda around the 3 waters regulation, because that has also been a regular topic on our agendas around both what's happening at a regional level and what's happening at a national level, and Tony and Craig are going to present on that in the next item, so I haven't gone into any detail on that. But that's really it, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take questions, and maybe someone else from the working group can answer if I can't.
Do we have within this group, or do the territorial authorities have within their work streams an ability to generate a cost estimate for water metering of the scale that was being discussed earlier in this meeting? Does somebody know what it would cost to do that?
I suspect Hastings has done that exercise, has it, Craig? I'm not sure about Napier, but Craig first.
Prior to me joining council, there was some very early work done for Hastings, and the number, I think, was in the order of about $20 million at that stage. However, technology's moved on, cost effectiveness has moved on, and because we've been putting in for quite a number of years, when a new property goes in or we're replacing a connection, we have a double check valve non-testable device on a residential property and what's called a manifold, and that manifold has a place where you could screw meter in, so some of the cost for installation will be lower. As part of a lower north, sort of central New Zealand user group that a number of the councils here attend, Josh and John, along with myself. There's been discussion going on in that meeting, hosted in Wellington, around some of the new technologies as well, and who's doing what and what it's costing them to put smart meters in, because the problem with just manual meters, the capital cost is only one part. It's that whole regime of reading the meters, and you don't get that active feedback that Dr. Graham was talking about. So I don't have a number on me what it would cost to go that way, but it's definitely an area of focus that we're all looking at. We as a supply, just like the other suppliers, we have, I think, in the order of about 500 across the network that we use for just monitoring general use. So it's about building on that, but the direction of travel is around that smart meter approach, so you can...
so should the number be coming down from the 20 million?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a couple of good case examples. Kapiti are actually in that user group that Mr. Kingsford and Mr. Lloyd and myself have been going along to, so we're sort of trying to leverage that. Wellington Water themselves are looking at that issue. I don't have a number now, but it's one that we will get to.
Sorry. Yeah.
We have a rough estimate for smart metering of 27 million. We need more work to refine that number.
27.
Through the Chair, if we could just add to that, a lot of those estimates are based around smart metering to inform the cost of water. So what Jim's talking about is a much higher regime and will require another level of investigation software perhaps on how you take the data from water meters and turn it into information that's useful for the purpose that he's talking about. So sure. That's probably a level of interrogation of that sort of data that New Zealand hasn't gone anywhere near to date.
That's to determine
the clarification on that thing.
That's to determine the water loss overall and be able to work out where it's happening and how to manage it.
On it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah. Gareth. Yeah. The question I would have would be the future work for the joint working group. What are the intentions there, Liz? Do you know? Do you need some steerance from this committee or guidance from this committee as to what you should be up to next?
Yeah, I think, thank you, through you, Mr Chair. I think just at the end of the last working group meeting, only last week, there was a more broad discussion really around what next for the working group, and certainly not assuming that we've run out of work, because we haven't. But I think it's a recognition that there was a lot of pressure on, particularly on Napier and Hastings councils, to identify the source protection zones for tank. And, you know, that very much was, and for the group itself to, you know, work on draft rules to put forward to as part of the tank process. And I think now that there was a bit of discussion really arising out of Craig's presentation on the Hastings Water Safety Plan about shared learnings and practices and things like that. And I think that there'll be initially at least following the election, there'll be a focus for us as a working group around that kind of activity. But obviously, you know, I'm assuming that this governance committee will carry on, and that there'll be further direction from the committee about our future work. But we're not complaining that we've got nothing to do.
That's cool.
Thanks. Any other questions? If not, then again, it's a recommendation to receive and note the joint working group's update. Would someone like to move? Thank you. Seconded. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. The next item on the agenda is the Three Waters update, and we've got Tony here as well in a position to contribute to that along with Craig.
Good morning, thank you. I take it that the report within the document has been read. I've just got a couple of things that I'd like to add to this as an update. In the report, we've completed our review to the best extent, noting that there's been some significant changing factors with the new regulation and some further questions that we need to respond to before we present our recommendations to our chief executives and then to council. In terms of the announcements with Cabinet, there was a fund that was made available for those first-in councils who are voluntarily looking at their structure formats for Three Waters. Unfortunately, at this stage, government still hasn't defined that process. There's a meeting between the ministers on the 12th of September. So the expression of interest, which I've noted in this paper, still hasn't been formally received until they have defined that process. Actively working with DIA and also working with the chief executives at the moment to look at where are some opportunities for us to continue some work without the requirement for further funding, but noting that we expect to get some from government in the near future. One of the components of the next stage of the project plan is that we will be seeking a governance structure for the Three Waters review. So I'm just raising that, not for discussion now, but in the future. So where you're talking about this group's potential governance, that could be an option going forward. Are there any questions on the paper submitted or the update?
Yeah, Garth. Yes. You mentioned that you'd finished a draft review, or you had a draft review which was with the chief executives. When would you expect that to come back to this group or this committee?
Yeah, unfortunately the delays with the government funding for the phase 2 of activity have meant that the project has halted.
Yeah.
As we will require some resources to support us through that next stage. So the review that we have completed is incomplete.
Yeah.
Incomplete. We need to do further analysis with the new regulatory changes on our models to encompass the regulatory changes to waste, storm and drinking water, as well as... Alec, did you want to say something?
Yeah, we have a chief executive sitting at the table, so we're very fortunate to be able to get the
through you, Mr Chair. So Councillor Bailey, while Ms Goodlass has obviously talked about how stage 1 of the review is complete, as a group of chief executives we have asked for further work to be done before we have confidence that we are in a position to offer options and recommendations to our 5 councils. So there are some specific questions that we still want answered. That is the work that Ms Goodlass is leading, but we are awaiting government money to help us complete some of the answers to those really important questions.
Yeah, no, that's good. And you're quite happy that'll be sometime in the new year?
Early new year.
No, that's fine.
It's quite interesting that one of Jim's observations from those his overseas travels is in actual fact the structure effectively being depoliticised and having an independent board running water. Now, the question is, do they do that at a national level or a regional level, or can it be even some mix of that? So it'll be quite interesting to see how that starts to evolve under the wider government strategy as well. Any other questions?
If I can respond to that through the Chair. The initiative with the voluntary fund is about the regions looking at the moment to help lead that thinking for government, which is our initiative. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if there's no further questions, then would someone like to move that? Sorry, sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, we're just going to
on the National 3 Waters update. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes. So I haven't prepared anything earlier. So just probably a key overview for those of you that may not be fully aware. So government a couple of months ago, Cabinet went through a number of issues in terms of in the 3 Waters field. One was around the setting up of the regulator, and there's further Cabinet papers due next month. Which will look to formulate that entity. Rumours are that that's an entity looking in the scale of 157 employees, excluding administrative staff. So that already sends something for us to think about: is how will they resource that, and will that empty out from those who are actually delivering? So that's an item we'll need to keep an eye on as a region in terms of moving forward. In terms of where they got to in terms of legislation and direction of travel, signals around standards and focus, there's very minor changes to what will be in the regulations at a legislative level. They're pretty much some minor changes, although very important minor changes, into what's currently in the Health Act and moving that into what will become a water bill. In terms of obligation, it's being far more definitive on the obligations of a drinking water supplier. However, the definition and the realm of those who are included and will be eventually under the eyes of the new regulator has extended much deeper into our community. So the only entities that are excluded from the regulator's oversight is pure self-supplies. So if you're a house with a water tank or a bore and you just service yourself, you will be excluded from the regulator's activities as it's currently drafted. However, if you're a farm and you have a water supply and you push that water supply to your neighbour, you are now officially a water supplier, and the Act and the legislation will apply to you. Obviously it will take time before a regulator would get down to that level. And this committee's talked about it before, so a key area of focus will be around some of our smaller communities who have private schemes or community-based schemes. A lot to think about around Papakaianga developments that have happened, farms with multiple homesteads on them. So there's a lot to work through around how that will work, and then how do we as a region support our community in delivering that. Hastings as an example, the Te Pahui community had a private scheme, and they've requested that our council, that my council take that back over, and we're in the process of transitioning that for that 30 households in a school of 30 children. But I think we'll see more of those. There is an obligation in the Act to, I think, resurrect and recreate what is currently called sanitary assessments, which were done probably a decade and a half ago, Jim. And that's looking at how wastewater and drinking water is provided. So there's a lens to relook at that. So that will see us having to look at communities such. For Hastings, for example, we currently don't supply wastewater into some of our coastal communities. We've got areas of Waipatu we're currently having discussions with in the Napier area, things like Miani. So there's a whole parcel of work depending on where this legislation goes. It's primarily focused drinking water, but there are some starter for 10s into the wastewater and stormwater space, particularly around a direction of travel into more risk assessment in the way that Jim talked about for drinking water into stormwater risks and wastewater risks, and that'll obviously be informed by the new NPS that's getting released shortly. But also within that catchment management, source protection zone space, requirements for regional councils and a water supply to work very closely together around having a catchment risk assessment, to have monitoring and a lot more monitoring required over and above what has been the national environmental monitoring that we've been working as a region to date. They do have around disinfection into the reticulation, it's mandatory exempt. They have noted an exemption. However, helpfully or completely unhelpfully, they haven't described yet, and my understanding, and Jim may be closer to it, no one has done any work at central government at any level of what would an exemption look like. I think the best place to start for us all to think about is Denmark is probably the benchmark. So if someone's looking for an exemption, you'll be looking at leak levels less than 5%, high levels of storage control, those type of things. So that's a lot to wait and see, and I get the feeling from a personal opinion that Ministry of Health are parking that and waiting for the regulator to take that over when that regulator gets created. There might be others from John and Jim to add.
Through you,
Yes.
Mr. Chair, Craig, it's probably worth making a point about the obligations that the proposal places on local government with regard to the oversight that you talked about.
Yes, so if a local council may not be the drinking water supplier, so if I use another example, there are a couple of private suppliers within the Hastings district and Breckenridge area, just around Oranui Road is one. So there would be an oversight requirement on the local authority to ensure all of the community are receiving safe drinking water, even if you're not the managing control. So it almost creates a duplication of that regulator's role. And I think that's an area of further discussion with the regulator and how do they see that happening efficiently. But and the inference on local government plays into a bit of the space which is grey, and this nothing to date has made it less grey, is what does a potable water supply look like for a self-supply? There's still greyness around what's expected for a household, because under local government, under their building control, have to ensure that everyone has a potable water supply. So there's some area in there. Probably the other one that John, that question of Mr. Kingsford's reminded me of, particularly for the larger supplies, there is timeframes noted in the cabinet paper of 5 years being fully at standard. Not working towards a standard, but fully at standard. And I think there's, depending on the gap, because we haven't seen the new standards yet, they're not released, 5 years, whilst is a very good goal, might not be reasonably practicable from a market delivery perspective, from a design and advisement perspective, and depending on how the funding's working, from a funding approach. We know now that the current infrastructure delivery market is highly heated, and prices are duly elevated in recognition of that.
Does that still allow, in terms of the consenting processes that will be required in many of these situations?
It is silent on those issues, which is similar to the questions we asked the policy writer who was assisting DIA and Ministry of Health around. We asked them questions around some of the consenting and reverse effects elements around source protection zones and all of that space. It was clear that he wasn't quite connected to some of the implementation issues. But these are all discussions we'll need to have as this develops on.
Sorry.
Through you again, Mr. Chair. I think it's just worth noting with all of the points that Craig has raised is that our industry isn't resourced to deliver all of that today. Whether you're talking about within local government, within our consultants, or within our contractors. So the bar there is quite high to achieve, and very difficult to understand how we might do that. Thank you.
No. Sorry. Tom?
Maybe this isn't the right moment to ask this, but you said something that triggered the question, so I will. Are we expecting to be told by the government that chlorine is a obligatory additive? Is that the bailout that local authorities are looking for, or are we going to be left to everybody row their own boat here on this issue?
So I'll let Dr. Graham clarify if I get this wrong, but my reading of the Cabinet paper and some other discussion documents is residual disinfection is mandatory unless you get an exemption to an unknown bar.
An exemption?
So we don't know what the exemption looks like.
Oh.
So you are directed to have chlorine. If you don't want to have chlorine, you will need to demonstrate that all of those risks within the distribution system are managed to a third party's approval.
Okay.
Thanks.
So, yeah. Yes.
It's a way of having it without having it. Any other questions of Craig? Or if not, would someone like to move that the Three Waters update be received and noted, please? Thanks, Tom.
Happy to do that in a second, Chair.
Thanks, Paul. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. Well, that brings us to the end of the agenda, and we're within our 5 minutes within our time allocation. So, well done, everybody. Again, for those that did join us, thank you for your participation and attendance. And I will declare the meeting closed. Thanks.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
But the